The forest was silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the cold evening breeze. Jake Miller, a solitary survivalist living miles from civilization, had just finished repairing the roof of his cabin when he saw it. A fiery streak tore across the sky, like a comet breaking apart as it descended. The explosion that followed shook the ground, sending birds scattering in all directions. Jake grabbed his flashlight and rifle. Curiosity tugged at him stronger than caution, though he was no stranger to the dangers of the wilderness. Whatever had crashed wasn't ordinary. It felt otherworldly. He trudged through the dense trees, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. As he approached the crash site, the air grew warmer, almost electric. The smell of burnt metal and scorched earth hit him like a wall. In the middle of a smoldering crater lay a vessel unlike anything he had ever seen. Its sleek, metallic surface shimmered faintly even in the dim light. Broken pieces of glowing blue material were scattered around, and the hum of dying machinery filled the air. Jake's eyes widened as he saw a figure lying near the wreckage. It was humanoid, but clearly not human. She, at least he thought it was a she, had pale lavender skin that seemed to glow faintly under the moonlight. Her hair was a cascade of silver, matted with dirt and blood. Her attire was torn and singed, revealing an intricate suit that looked like it belonged in a science fiction movie. Cautiously, Jake knelt beside her. She was unconscious, her breathing shallow. Her chest rose and fell erratically, and her face was twisted in pain. "Hey, can you hear me?" Jake asked, unsure if she even spoke his language. No response. He hesitated, but his instincts kicked in. She needed help fast. He carefully lifted her, surprised by how light she was despite her height. Her body felt fragile, like she could break with too much pressure. Carrying her back to the cabin wasn't easy. The terrain was rough, and her unconscious form made him slow. By the time he reached his cabin, sweat dripped down his face despite the cold. He laid her on his bed, noticing the deep gash running along her side. A strange, bluish fluid seeped from the wound. It wasn't blood, at least not like anything he'd seen before. Jake rummaged through his supplies, grabbing bandages and antiseptics. But as he tried to clean the wound, her body convulsed slightly, and she let out a weak groan. Her eyes fluttered open, revealing irises that shimmered like molten gold. "Who are you?" she rasped, her voice weak but commanding. "Someone trying to help," Jake replied firmly, though his heart raced. He had so many questions, but one thing was clear. This wasn't just an alien. It was someone important. The crash wasn't an accident, and whoever, or whatever, was after her might come looking. For now, though, saving her life was his priority. The golden glow of her eyes faded as her eyelids drooped, exhaustion pulling her back into unconsciousness. Jake sat back, staring at her, unsure what to do next. The alien woman, because that's what she was, no denying it, needed medical help far beyond what his supplies could offer. Her strange bluish blood didn't clot like human blood, and the wound looked deeper than he first thought. Jake sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "All right, lady, let's see what I can do." He worked quickly, cleaning the wound with boiled water and sterilized cloth. Every touch made her flinch and murmur in her strange language. But she didn't wake up again. Jake noticed the intricate patterns on her suit. The fabric was lightweight but stronger than anything he'd ever seen, almost like woven metal. He wondered who, or what, she was running from. Once the wound was wrapped as best as he could manage, Jake turned his attention to the strange blue liquid that had leaked onto his hands. It shimmered faintly under the dim light of the lantern. He carefully wiped it away, but the glow seemed to linger on his skin, like some kind of bioluminescence. "Great," he muttered. "Probably radioactive or something." He had no time to worry about it. Outside, the forest was alive with night sounds, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching. He double-checked the locks on the door and windows before returning to the unconscious alien. Hours passed, and she finally stirred again. Her breathing was steadier now, and when her eyes opened, they were sharper, more aware. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice still weak but clearer than before. Her accent was strange, but she spoke English, sort of. "You're in my cabin," Jake said, keeping his voice calm. "You crashed in the forest. I brought you here to help." Her eyes narrowed, and she struggled to sit up, only to wince and clutch her side. "Why? Why would you help me?" Jake raised an eyebrow. "You're bleeding out in the middle of nowhere. Should I have just left you there?" "Yes," she snapped, her golden eyes flashing with defiance. "You don't understand. Helping me puts you in danger. They'll come for me." "Who's they?" Jake asked, leaning closer. "And why are they after you?" She hesitated, her gaze flickering to the bandage on her side. Her expression softened, though she still looked wary. "You shouldn't have gotten involved. Now they'll hunt you too." Jake smirked. "Lady, I live alone in the middle of nowhere. If they want to fight, they'll regret coming here." Her lips twitched, almost forming a smile, but it faded quickly. "You don't understand. They are relentless. They will find us." Jake shrugged. "Then we'll deal with it when they do. For now, you need rest." For the first time, her defiance faltered, and she nodded slightly. Jake could see it in her eyes. Fear, exhaustion, and maybe a flicker of trust. The cabin was quiet, except for the crackling of the small fire Jake had lit to keep the room warm. The alien woman lay on his bed, her breathing steady now, though she still looked pale. Jake sat nearby, sharpening his knife. His mind raced with questions, but he knew she needed time to recover before he could press her for answers. Eventually, she stirred again. Her golden eyes flickered open, scanning the room cautiously. Jake noticed her tense posture as she tried to sit up, and he quickly moved to help her. "Take it easy," he said, his tone firm but calm. "You're still hurt." She hesitated before allowing him to help her sit against the wall. Her eyes studied him with a mix of suspicion and curiosity. "Why do you care?" she asked, her voice softer this time. "You don't even know who I am." Jake leaned back in his chair and shrugged. "You're hurt, and I was the only one around to do something about it. That's all there is to it." She frowned, her expression hard to read. "My name is Silara," she said after a moment. "And I am not ordinary." Jake smirked. "Yeah, I figured that much. Regular people don't crash alien ships into forests." Silara ignored his sarcasm. "I'm serious. You need to understand what you've done by helping me. My people." She paused, her jaw tightening as if the thought pained her. "They will not stop searching for me." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Your people, they're the ones after you." She nodded, her gaze distant. "I ran away. They'll see my escape as a betrayal, and they'll do whatever it takes to bring me back or silence me." Jake crossed his arms, his expression thoughtful. "And what about me? Now that I've helped you, am I on their hit list too?" Silara's silence was answer enough. "Great," Jake muttered, running a hand through his hair. "Just another day in the life of a guy who wanted some peace and quiet." Her lips twitched, almost forming a smirk, but it disappeared quickly. "You don't understand the danger. They are relentless, highly trained, and have technology far beyond anything on this planet. If they find us, they won't hesitate to destroy everything in their path." Jake met her gaze, his expression calm but determined. "I've faced danger before. I'm not afraid of a fight." Silara looked at him for a long moment, as if trying to gauge whether he was being serious. Finally, she sighed. "You're either brave or foolish, human." "Maybe a little of both," Jake replied with a grin. Her expression softened slightly, though the tension in her shoulders didn't fully ease. "I need to recover quickly. If I'm stronger, I can fight them off myself." Jake gestured toward her wound. "Then you'd better stay put and let me help you heal. Fighting's no good if you can't stand." For the first time, Silara allowed herself to relax, even if only a little. Maybe, just maybe, she could trust him. The days passed in a slow blur. Jake kept to his routine, checking the traps around his cabin, gathering firewood, and making sure Silara had enough to eat and drink. The wound on her side was healing, though slowly. Silara was still cautious, keeping her distance whenever possible, but Jake had grown used to her silent presence. She spent most of her time lying on the bed, staring out the window, lost in thought. Jake couldn't help but wonder about her. She wasn't like any alien he had ever heard of. Her behavior was strange. She was so proud, so different from the survivors he'd met in the wilderness. And yet, despite her pride, there was a vulnerability in her eyes that Jake couldn't ignore. It made him feel a strange need to protect her, even though he had no idea who she really was or why she was being hunted. One evening, as the fire crackled softly in the corner of the room, Silara sat up on the bed, her gaze distant. She hadn't said much in hours, but Jake could tell she was thinking hard about something. He decided to press her again. "All right, I need some answers," Jake said, leaning forward in his chair. "You've been avoiding the subject long enough. What exactly are you running from? Why are they after you?" Silara stiffened, her eyes narrowing as she looked at him. "You think you're ready for the truth?" she asked, her voice cold. Jake raised his hands. "I don't know what the truth is, but you got me involved in this. I might as well know what's going on." She hesitated, glancing toward the window as if she expected someone to be watching them. "Fine, but you may wish you didn't ask." She let out a sigh, a heavy one that seemed to carry the weight of her past. "I come from a royal family," she began, her voice quieter now. "I was never meant to be a leader, but my people thought I would be the perfect symbol to keep things under control. I was used as a tool in political games, marriage proposals, alliances, all for the sake of power. But I didn't want any of it. I wanted freedom." Jake listened quietly, his eyes not leaving her as she spoke. "So you ran away?" he asked, his tone gentle. "Yes," she said with a sharp nod. "But my family won't let me go. They will stop at nothing to bring me back, to make me their puppet again. They'll destroy anyone in their way." Jake couldn't help but feel sympathy for her. He had seen enough of the world to know how power and control could ruin lives. "Sounds like you've been dealt a bad hand," he said quietly. Silara's eyes flashed with a fire Jake hadn't seen before. "I don't need your sympathy. I made my choice. I will never go back to them." Jake gave her a small nod, his expression serious. "And I'll help you make sure they don't find you." Silara studied him for a long moment, her golden eyes unreadable. For the first time, she didn't look at him like a stranger. There was something else there now, something like trust. "Thank you," she said quietly, almost as if she hadn't meant to say it. "But it's not enough to just hide. We have to fight." Jake leaned back in his chair, considering her words. "We'll figure something out. I'm not going down without a fight either." Silara looked at him with new understanding. Maybe, just maybe, this human wasn't so different from her after all. The next morning, the silence of the forest felt heavier than usual. Jake went about his daily chores, but his mind kept drifting back to Silara's story. He had no idea what her people were capable of, but one thing was clear. They were ruthless. And now that he had helped her, he was a target too. As he chopped wood outside, his ears picked up something faint, a sound that didn't belong. At first, he thought it was just the wind, but then he heard it again. The unmistakable hum of engines, distant but growing louder. His heart skipped a beat. Jake's gaze shot toward the sky. There were no planes in these parts, nothing but the occasional helicopter. But this was different. The hum wasn't coming from above. It was moving through the trees. He grabbed his rifle, the familiar weight reassuring in his hands, and sprinted toward the cabin. Inside, Silara was standing by the window, her sharp eyes scanning the horizon. She didn't need to ask. She could feel it too. "They're here," Silara said, her voice low but steady. Jake nodded. Bounty hunters. Not just any hunters, she said, her voice tight with tension. These are the best. Trained to find and capture, sometimes kill, targets like me. Jake clenched his jaw. What do we do now? We hide, Silera said, turning toward the back of the cabin. I can't fight them alone, but I can still move quickly. If we get to the forest, I can lead them away. Jake didn't argue. He knew they couldn't take on a team of highly trained bounty hunters without a plan. All right, let's go. They moved quickly, gathering what little they could carry in case they needed to flee. Silera winced as she moved, her injury still a problem, but she didn't complain. She had bigger things on her mind now. The sound of the engines grew louder, and Jake's heart pounded in his chest. They couldn't waste any more time. He grabbed Silara's arm gently, guiding her toward the back door. The sun was starting to dip below the tree line, casting long shadows over the cabin. Jake opened the door slowly, peeking outside. The forest was quiet for now. He stepped out first, keeping his head low and his eyes on the trees. Silera followed behind, her movements swift despite the pain she must have been feeling. Stay close, Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. If they see us, we won't make it. Silera didn't need reminding. She moved as if she had been trained for this kind of escape her whole life. Her eyes darted back and forth, scanning for any sign of the hunters. The tension was thick in the air, and Jake's every step felt heavy as they made their way deeper into the woods. They reached the edge of the clearing when Silera stopped suddenly. She held up her hand, signaling for Jake to freeze. He obeyed without question, his ears straining for any sound. Footsteps, coming closer. They were getting close. Silera looked at him with a mixture of determination and fear in her eyes. We're not safe yet. We need to move. Jake held his breath, crouched behind a thick tree trunk, his eyes fixed on Silera. She was tense, her body frozen like a predator in waiting. Her ears, sharper than his, had heard something he hadn't. The footsteps were closer now, unmistakable, crunching over the dry leaves and branches. Silara's golden eyes met his, her expression serious. She raised her hand in a gesture of silence, her finger pressing to her lips. Then, without a sound, she motioned for him to follow. They moved silently through the underbrush, their footsteps barely audible. Jake kept close behind, his heart thudding in his chest. They were moving deeper into the forest now, heading away from the direction of the cabin. Minutes passed, each one feeling like an eternity. The distant sound of engines was still there, but the hunters hadn't spotted them yet. Jake could feel the tension in the air, thick enough to cut with a knife. The feeling of being hunted was suffocating. As they reached a small clearing, Silera stopped again, her body stiff with alertness. Jake almost bumped into her. Her golden eyes were fixed on something, and Jake followed her gaze, expecting to see movement. But the forest was empty. Still. Silera finally let out a slow breath, her shoulders relaxing just a little. They're not as close as I thought, she said, her voice quiet but steady. Jake looked around, feeling the weight of the silence. We can't be too careful. How much longer can we keep this up? Silera paused, looking up at the trees above them. Long enough, she replied, her eyes clouded with something he couldn't quite place. But we don't have much time. There was a weight in her voice that Jake hadn't heard before. It was clear she was still recovering, both from her injury and whatever had happened before her crash. He could sense that there was more she wasn't telling him. Silera, Jake began softly. What's going on? What exactly are you running from? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned her gaze to the ground, as though considering whether or not to speak. For a long moment, the only sound was the soft rustling of the wind through the trees. I told you my people are after me, she said at last, her voice quieter than usual. But there's more to it than that. They're not just trying to bring me back. They want to control me. Jake frowned, not fully understanding. Control you? For what? Silara's lips pressed into a tight line, and she seemed to struggle with her words. I'm the heir to a throne. Not just any throne, Jake. My people rule an entire galaxy. Jake blinked. Wait. What? Silara nodded, her gaze distant. I was never supposed to rule. My family wanted me to be a figurehead, to marry for power and keep the status quo. But I hated the idea of being a pawn in their games. Jake's mind raced. A princess. An alien royal with control over an entire galaxy. It was hard to process, but as he looked at Silara, he saw the pain in her eyes, the weight of her words. They wanted to use me to strengthen their alliances, she continued, her voice heavy with regret. But I couldn't do it. I couldn't be their tool. So I ran. Jake nodded slowly. You didn't just run from your people. You ran from a whole galaxy. Silara's eyes met his again, and for the first time, Jake saw something else in them. It was a mix of fear, defiance, and something deeper, something human. She wasn't just a princess from another world. She was someone who had fought for her freedom. I had to, she whispered, but they won't stop. And now, neither will you. Jake didn't know what to say to that. He hadn't signed up for anything this big, but somehow he couldn't walk away now. You're not alone, he said quietly, his voice firm. Silara didn't respond at first, but when she looked at him, he saw something shift in her eyes. Maybe, just maybe, she was starting to believe him. The sun had dipped behind the trees, and the shadows stretched long across the forest floor. Jake and Silara moved quietly through the underbrush, their steps measured and careful. Every now and then, Jake would glance at Silara, her face set in a grim mask of determination. She was tough, that was clear, but Jake could still see the lingering fatigue in her eyes. The crash, the injury, the hunters, it was all catching up to her. We can't keep running forever, Jake said in a low voice, his breath visible in the cool night air. Silara didn't reply right away, her gaze scanning the darkened forest. Her sharp eyes missed nothing. We'll have to fight them eventually, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. We can't outrun them forever. Jake nodded, his mind already working through their options. We're not exactly equipped for a fight. I've got a rifle, but that's about it. Silara's lips twitched into a faint, but knowing smile. I didn't come here to hide, Jake. I didn't survive all this to hide in the woods. I can fight. Jake raised an eyebrow, impressed by the confidence in her voice. You're not exactly in top shape. That wound. I'll manage, she interrupted, her voice sharper now. I've been through worse, and if I can't fight with my body, I'll fight with my mind. Jake paused, thinking about what she had just said. It was clear Silara wasn't just talking about her physical abilities. She had a certain edge to her, an intelligence, a sharpness that went beyond just survival. She was a princess, after all. Not just any princess, but the heir to an entire galaxy. What are you thinking? Jake asked, already knowing she had something planned. There's a way to turn the tables, Silara said, her eyes glinting in the moonlight. We use their own tracking systems against them. Jake wasn't sure he fully understood, but he trusted Silara. If anyone could turn the tide in their favor, it was her. We'll need to find their base of operations, she continued, her voice steady. Once we know where they're coming from, I can hack into their systems. I can disable their communication and tracking networks long enough to throw them off our trail. Jake's eyebrows furrowed. Hack. You can do that. Silara's lips quirked into a small smile. I told you, I'm not just a princess. I've had to learn things most royal heirs would never need to know. Jake could see that. Silara wasn't some pampered noble. She was a survivor, and despite everything, her past, her injuries, the danger closing in, she was still thinking ahead, still planning their next move. All right, so we find their base, and you do your thing, Jake said, sounding more confident than he felt. But how do we find them? They could be anywhere out here. Silara didn't hesitate. I have a way. She reached into a hidden pocket on her suit, pulling out a small device. It was sleek, metallic, and covered with strange markings. She held it up, and Jake could see it had a small screen. This is a signal tracker. I can use it to locate their equipment. Jake's eyes widened. He'd never seen anything like it. And this will work. Celara gave him a sharp, reassuring look. It will. Trust me. Jake didn't have time to argue. They had no other choice but to trust her. If they were going to survive this, they needed to use every advantage they could. Then let's do it, Jake said, his voice firm. Let's find them first and make sure they don't find us. Celara nodded, her expression one of quiet resolve. The forest around them felt even darker now, but there was a spark between them. An unlikely partnership. A human and an alien princess fighting to survive together. And for the first time since the crash, Jake felt like they might just have a chance. The night had grown colder, and the forest was alive with the distant calls of unseen creatures. Jake and Celara moved through the trees with purpose, the signal tracker in her hand flashing faintly in the darkness. The small device pulsed in her grip, a steady rhythm that seemed to match Jake's heartbeats. They had a plan, but every step toward the unknown felt like a gamble. Jake glanced over at Celara. Her face was determined, her posture straight despite the pain in her side. The wound she'd received from the crash had started healing, but she still moved cautiously, careful not to overexert herself. The tracker seemed to give her an extra burst of energy. She was focused, determined to end this chase once and for all. Not much further, she said, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. She glanced at the tracker. They're close. We'll need to move quickly. Jake nodded, his hand tightening on the rifle slung over his shoulder. The hunters could be anywhere, and the closer they got to their base, the more dangerous it became. But Celara was right. This was their best chance to turn the tide. They continued moving through the dense forest, keeping low to the ground and relying on the darkness to conceal them. The trees were thick, and the underbrush tangled, but they made their way through with the quiet efficiency of two people who had learned to survive under pressure. Jake was impressed by how well Celara moved. Despite her injury, she had the grace of someone who had been trained to navigate dangerous situations. After what felt like hours, they reached a clearing. The tracker in Celara's hand pulsed rapidly, indicating they were right on top of their target. The night air seemed to hum with energy, and Jake could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Stay close, Celara whispered, her eyes scanning the perimeter. She moved toward a large boulder at the edge of the clearing and crouched behind it, signaling for Jake to follow. Jake dropped to a crouch beside her. His eyes darted to the darkness beyond the clearing, where the flicker of distant lights seemed to indicate the presence of the hunters. He couldn't make out much in the gloom, but the unmistakable sound of voices reached his ears. Celara pressed the tracker against her chest, her eyes narrowing. "They're just ahead," she said, barely audible. "This is it." Jake's pulse quickened. He knew this was their moment, but it also felt like the calm before the storm. They had no more time to waste. Celara's escape had to happen now, before the hunters realized they were on their tail. Celara turned to Jake, her gaze steady and focused. "You know the risks. If we do this, there's no turning back." Jake looked her in the eye, his jaw set. "I'm in this with you, Celara. Let's end this." For a moment, they shared a brief, unspoken understanding. No more running, no more hiding. This was their chance to reclaim her freedom and to protect the life Jake had built for himself. Celara nodded, her lips tight. "Then let's make it count." She stood, her hand gripping a small device on her belt. Jake stood beside her, his eyes on the flickering lights ahead, ready for whatever came next. This was their fight now, and there was no turning back. The air was thick with tension as Jake and Celara moved toward the heart of the clearing, their footsteps light but purposeful. The distant hum of machinery grew louder, and the flicker of lights ahead grew brighter. They were close now, dangerously close. Silara's tracker had led them to what seemed like a temporary outpost, a base of operations for the bounty hunters who had been tracking her. The stakes were high, but there was no turning back now. Silara crouched behind a thick tree trunk, signaling for Jake to do the same. Her golden eyes studied the base ahead, her focus unwavering. The structure was simple but fortified. Metal walls, makeshift barriers, and a few patrols moving around the perimeter. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give her a good reason to be cautious. "Not much security," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. "But they won't be caught off guard for long." Silara nodded, her expression grim. "They know we're here. We're running out of time." Jake's heart pounded as he surveyed the area. He had no idea how they were going to take on a group of well-trained hunters with only a rifle and Silara's limited abilities, but they didn't have a choice. If they stayed hidden much longer, the hunters would close in, and they wouldn't get another shot at disabling their systems. "Let's move," Silara said, her voice steady, yet carrying an undercurrent of urgency. They crossed the clearing quickly, moving from one shadow to the next. The lights ahead flickered as they approached the outer perimeter of the base. Jake held his breath, every sense on high alert. If they were seen, their chances of escape would disappear in an instant. Silara reached for the small device at her waist, her fingers moving with practiced ease. The device blinked with life, sending a pulse through the air. Jake's eyes locked onto her. He had no idea what she was doing, but it was clear she was preparing something. "They'll notice the interference soon," Silara murmured. "We have to be ready to move fast." Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the air. A patrol on the edge of the base had stepped on a twig. Jake's heart skipped a beat as the sound of footsteps and voices began to fill the air. They had been spotted. Without missing a beat, Silara snapped into action. She moved quickly, signaling Jake to follow. They dashed for cover, ducking behind the walls of the base as the hunters closed in. The sound of approaching footsteps grew louder, but Jake couldn't see the hunters just yet. The darkness made it hard to distinguish shapes from shadows. "Get ready," Silara whispered. "I'll take care of the tracking systems. You handle the rest." Jake gave her a quick nod. His grip tightened on the rifle, and he shifted into a crouch, waiting for the first signs of movement. Then, just as the hunters were nearly upon them, Silara made her move. A loud, high-pitched tone rang out from the device in her hand. The base's lights flickered violently, and the hum of the machine slowed. Panic set in among the hunters as they scrambled to figure out what was happening. Jake didn't waste a second. He sprang from behind the cover, taking aim at the nearest hunter. The rifle kicked in his hands as the first shot rang out, striking the hunter square in the chest. The hunter crumpled to the ground without a sound. But there were more. A lot more. Jake dove behind a large metal crate as more shots were fired in his direction. His mind raced as he tried to process everything that was happening. Silara's technology, the hunters, the fight for survival. He couldn't afford to hesitate now. Through the chaos, he heard Silara's voice, cool and steady. "Keep them distracted. I need a few more seconds." Jake could hear her tapping at the device, her fingers moving with expert speed. She was almost there. Suddenly, the sound of gunfire stopped, and Jake looked up to see the remaining hunters retreating, confusion written across their faces. They didn't know what had just happened, but they were clearly thrown off by the interference. Silara stepped forward, her expression fierce. "It's done," she said, her voice full of relief. "Their tracking system is down." Jake let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. They had done it. For now, at least. But the fight wasn't over. The hunters would regroup, and they wouldn't stop until they had Silara. But for the first time, Jake felt a spark of hope. They weren't running anymore. They were fighting back. And together, they could win. The clearing was still, the distant hum of the base's machinery now silent. Jake and Silara, crouched behind the same metal crate that had served as their last cover, their breaths coming in short, sharp gasps. The fight had been quick but intense, and now that the hunters had retreated, there was a brief moment of peace. Scifi glanced at Jake, her golden eyes still bright with focus, but a flicker of relief danced in them. She had done it. Disabling their tracking systems had given them the upper hand. But they both knew it wouldn't last long. The hunters would regroup, and they wouldn't stop until they had captured her. The only question was whether they could get out of this alive. Jake wiped the sweat from his brow, his rifle still tightly gripped in his hands. He had been in dangerous situations before, but nothing like this. He had come to the forest for solitude, a break from the world, never imagining that his life would turn into a battle for survival with an alien princess at his side. And yet, here they were. Scifi stood slowly, her body still stiff from the injury, but her determination unwavering. She looked out over the clearing, scanning for any signs of movement. "We have to move now," she said, her voice low but firm. "The hunters will be back soon, and they'll be angry." Jake nodded, understanding the urgency. "Where to?" She didn't hesitate. "There's a safe house not far from here. My people set it up for emergencies. We can rest there, regroup, and figure out our next move." Jake was surprised. He hadn't known Scifi's people had such resources, but it made sense. She wasn't just a princess. She was a survivor, and she'd been prepared for situations like this. "Lead the way," he said, already moving behind her. The forest felt different now. There was still danger lurking, but with every step they took, Jake felt a sense of purpose settle in his chest. They weren't running anymore. They had fought back, and together they were a team. As they moved through the trees, Scifi's pace was quick, though she occasionally winced in pain. Jake stayed close, watching her carefully. She was tougher than most people he knew, but he could see the strain in her eyes. He had to admit, though, he was impressed. She had led them through an impossible situation, and now they had a chance. After what seemed like an eternity of moving through the dense woods, they finally reached a small clearing. In the middle stood a well-hidden structure, camouflaged by the trees around it. It was a small cabin, nothing like the fortress Jake had imagined, but it looked sturdy enough. Scifi reached for a hidden panel on the side of the building and pressed a sequence of buttons. A door slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a small interior that was surprisingly well stocked. There was a bed, a few chairs, and some basic supplies, enough for them to rest and plan their next move. Scifi stepped inside, motioning for Jake to follow. As they entered, she paused and turned to him. "Thank you, Jake," she said, her voice softer than usual. "I couldn't have made it this far without you." Jake gave a small half-smile. "You've done most of the work. I'm just here for the ride." She smiled faintly in return. "You're not just here for the ride. You've risked everything to help me. You're not like the others." Jake wasn't sure how to respond, so he just nodded. It felt good to hear her say that, even if it wasn't necessary. They had both chosen this path together, and that was enough. The door slid shut behind them, sealing them inside. The warmth of the cabin filled the air, and for the first time in days, Jake allowed himself to relax. But even as he settled, a nagging thought lingered in his mind. The hunters would come again. And next time, they might not be so lucky. But for now, they had a moment of peace, and that was enough. Scifi turned to the small communication device on the wall, her expression hardening as she began to send out a signal. Her fight wasn't over, but this time, she wasn't alone. And for the first time since her crash, Scifi dared to believe they might have a chance to win.